Welcome to the Fear and Greed Daily Interview. I'm Sean Aylmer. I mentioned late last month the release of the federal government's Intergenerational Report. It's essentially a look at the next 40 years, considering the outlook for the economy and the budget in coming decades. As part of that, the report considers the long-term impact of current policies, as well as how the economy could be affected by factors like demographic changes, think immigration and population growth, as well as the ageing population. It's really worth a closer look because there are some fascinating elements to it. David Robertson is the Head of Economic and Markets Research at Bendigo and Adelaide Bank. He joins me this morning. David, welcome to Fear and Greed.
Thanks very much, Sean. It's great to be with you.
So how reliable are forecasts that are looking 40 years into the future?
Yes, Sean, that's a fair question given the Treasury forecasts. Well, they don't have a great track record over 4-year periods with the forward estimates in each year's budget. So it's hard to have a lot of confidence about 40-year forecasts. But look, the modelling in the Intergenerational Report, it does test the assumptions and the key variables. I think it does give valuable insights. It shows how sensitive our economy is to, say, population growth changes and other demographic change, how sensitive the economy is to interest rates and so on. And I think it does also just show that policymakers are looking forward and considering the reality of demographic change. So, no, I don't expect the forecasts will necessarily be all that accurate. And look, as it happens, there are some glaring omissions in terms of what they're modelling. There's not a lot of modelling around climate change, for example, and what it's going to do to budget costs and revenue and so on. But what has been modelled and projected for 40 years is fascinating. How the forecasts have evolved from previous intergenerational reports, I think, is also insightful. And how the country responds to the reality of demographic change is a critical question to answer and to question how those inputs will change over the decades.
I remember when the first one came out, and I think it was under Peter Costello quite a while ago. The one thing about it that I did think back then was at least it makes people think about the future, because politics is so focused on the electoral cycle. To actually have something where you're thinking bigger picture, irrespective of whether you're coalition or Labor, is a good thing.
Absolutely. And I think that first one was back in 2002. And yes, it's one thing to be cynical about exactly how accurate the forecasts will be in 40 years' time, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't be thinking about that and at least considering demographic change and going through the process.
Yeah. So the report starts with the statement that COVID-19 will have lasting effects on the economy and the budget. Whilst we're all in the middle of it, and when many people are in the middle of a lockdown, it's really hard right now. It is only a moment of time. And 2020, 2021 will probably in history be looked back as those dreadful years, I suppose a bit like 17, 18 with the Spanish flu, or was it 18, 19, I think, with the Spanish flu.
1917, was it? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, so it is just a moment in time, but it's just interesting that the Intergenerational Report says this actually will be a marker for decades to come.
Yeah, that's right. And you look at how strong the recovery has been thus far. So, I think it is important to differentiate between temporary one-off factors versus lasting impacts. So it's been great to see the economy respond to policy support. Measures of, economic growth are now above pre-pandemic levels, even though Sydney and Victoria were back in lockdown. So, the vaccinations can't come soon enough. But if we think about the post-pandemic economy, once, say, over 80% of the adult population is vaccinated, by then the economy hopefully will be back pretty close to full capacity. Nevertheless, there will still be lasting impacts from the pandemic, and they'll mainly be around high levels of government debt, which was necessary to deal with the health crisis, and also the impact that there's been on population growth, what that means for the ageing of population and so on. So if we think about government debt now in the Intergenerational Report, there are structural deficits for the budget as far as the eye can see. And that is a material change from the last Intergenerational Report back in 2015, which had surpluses. It had no net debt by 2030. So there are material changes, and I think they will be more permanent. And actually, if we think about the government's fiscal response, embracing fiscal policy, I think it's been the factor that set up the strong economic rebound, and these latest outbreaks and lockdowns just show that we need more. But, Australia's AAA credit rated. We had that affirmed by Standard & Poor's recently. So, if we think about the impact of the pandemic on that, and that's outlined in the Intergenerational Report, structural deficits and high government debt, that's going to be in place for decades. But, I'm okay with that as long as we continue to grow the economy and we grow it inclusively and sustainably, focus on productivity to lift living standards, then that's an impact of the pandemic that we can live with the correct policy response to grow the economy, to deal with higher levels of government debt.
So we'll come to population growth in a moment, but maybe one thing about the pandemic is it's made debt okay again, because for many decades it wasn't, and governments campaigned on that. But also, what about the way we live our lives? I mean, e-commerce is a very obvious example of that. Things that the pandemic that's occurred during 2020 and into 2021, which will fundamentally change the way commerce works in society.
Yeah, that's right. And look, we were already heading in that direction if we think about how we were undertaking commerce, how we were shopping, an increasing percentage of that online. And that percentage has gradually been creeping higher, but it's taken a quantum leap through the pandemic. So now 2020, such a difficult year for businesses, but a lot of businesses have used this tectonic shift, if you like, in behaviour to really reassess their business models and to say, all right, well, we knew people would be doing more click and collect and more surfing the net to investigate a product and then maybe coming into our shop to buy. But now we need to make sure we've got a robust business model which caters even more so for the online, for the virtual experience. So, yeah, that was, if I can say, an evolutionary process, has been a sudden tectonic shift and businesses have needed to jump with it. But if you look at the aggregate data, a lot of businesses have managed to achieve that.
Yeah.
It's just so uneven, unfortunately, the recovery. So some have been left behind along the way.
Stay with me, David. We'll be back in a minute. My guest this morning is David Robertson, Head of Economic and Markets Research at Bendigo and Adelaide Bank. So let's get on to population growth, and economists love talking about population growth, David. What are the projections about the size of Australia's population going forward and the role of immigration and how COVID plays into that?
Yes, on the Intergenerational Report, and this is the first in the series where they've actually downgraded population growth. So we're still set to hit 30 million, but about 3 years later than had been forecast. So we'll get there by mid-2030s rather than about 2031. The report has the population reaching almost 39 million in 40 years' time. So look, if you look at the population growth rate, it had been running at about 1.5% per year. About 0.9% of that was coming from net migration to Australia, and the rest, about 0.6%, was coming from natural population growth. But in this latest report, both those percentage contributions are forecast to fall. So net migration, that's a policy decision. It can be increased. And in fact, some of the modelling in the report shows our economy would benefit if it was increased. But via policy, that's set in the report. It's modelled at being flatlined at 235,000 per year is the net migration increase. Natural population growth is falling simply because people are deciding to have less children. But, if we think about the impact of the pandemic on migration, we've closed international borders. Our population actually shrank in the third quarter of 2020, and we haven't actually had a shrinking population as a nation since 1916. So it was a significant demographic shock impacting on net migration. And, overall population, it's a key driver of economic growth along with productivity and participation rates and so on. So,
and that's because more people, bigger pie, broadly?
Well, you'd certainly rather have a growing population than a shrinking one.
Yeah.
If you think about, I suppose, how that flows through to productivity, how that flows through to demand. So, I think just a basic tenet is a growing population is better than a shrinking population. And I think that applies at a macro level as well as just through any city, town or suburb.
Yeah, and the report describes the ageing population as our greatest demographic challenge. Now, Japan is the standout, but also the other big economies like China is another one where you have definitely ageing population. What's that mean for an economy like Australia?
Yes, so an ageing population, and I think that's best measured by what's called the old age dependency ratio, which is just the number of working age Australians, those who are 15 to 64-year-old versus those who are 65 or older. And today that ratio is about 4, just under 4, but it was 6.5 in the early 80s. It was just over 5 at the start of the century. We're down to 4 and it's headed for 2.7. So basically what that means is for every working age person, their taxes will be needed to support a larger number of older Australians. And you can extend that logic to, implications for government spending on healthcare and the age pension and so on. So, that's the reason it's so important and why it's been given that title as our greatest demographic change. And if you look at the report, GDP growth is forecast to slow over the decades ahead because of that. It's forecast to be, down to only about 2.5% by 2050. So that does all feed into, income and standards of living. So certainly it is a huge challenge. I don't think it's insurmountable because leveraging innovation and technology I think can be the solution there. It's the same way we're going to beat climate change. But, all those scary things that lie in the decades ahead, it's all going to come back, I think, to leveraging technology. But look, yes, this demographic change, talked about the difficulties in long-term forecasting, but that's one trend that I'm very confident will happen. And that's why the report is so important to try to come up with solutions to that demographic change.
And I suppose one of the reasons why there was such a debate earlier this year and late last year about the superannuation guarantee and the idea of not increasing it to 12%, because retirement savings is obviously going to play a bigger role in the next 20, 30, 40 years.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And again, the Intergenerational Report talks about the pillars of retirement income being the age pension, the super guarantee and voluntary savings. And the aim is, or what the Treasurer hopes, I'm sure, is that there's more coming through personal voluntary savings and self-managed super funds, and that super is a larger piece of the pie, taking the pressure off the age pension. So great to see the super guarantee now up from 9.5 to 10. It's headed to 12% by 2025. And the report does show a rise over time of Australians not needing the pension as a percentage, and it shows a fall of those on the full rate age pension from around 50% today to only 25% by 2060. So they've got a lot riding on the super scheme working and greater voluntary savings. But hopefully that is a trend that does continue and that can reduce, I suppose, the burden of age pension from a budget expense point of view. But more importantly, it can lead to better, higher retirement incomes, therefore better standards of living in retirement.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a very sprightly 54-year-old, David, very sprightly, I'd like to add. But I think I've got 15 years of work left in me, which means I'm almost 70 by the time I retire. And I don't think I can rely on the pension. I just think that's to achieve the standard of life I want. And so I think probably people of my generation and younger increasingly are just going to have to assume they're not going to get the pension, or it's just a top-up at the end of the day.
Yeah, that's right. And I won't reveal my age, but I'll say I've had 2 AstraZeneca jabs. That can give you a clue. But yeah, it's, the age pension is there as a safety net, if you like, as a backup. But, what the report shows is that with appropriate levels of saving and voluntary contributions, we can reach through voluntary saving suitable levels of savings, and that will take the pressure off the age pension as that safety net.
Just a quick one, super for women. So an area where women certainly have fallen behind men, at least, is in superannuation savings. And much of that is because they have interruptions in their careers and women have not been paid as much as men over time. How does that play out in an intergenerational sense?
Yeah, look, the report did note the gender pay gap, the gender gap on super balances. It talked to what it called the accumulated economic disadvantages faced by women. So it acknowledged that reality. Fortunately, it does project a narrowing in the gap thanks to rising female participation rates, which are up at a record high, and higher voluntary contributions. So by the end of the 40-year projections, forward in 2060-61, the projected distributions of men versus women on their super balances at retirement looks far more equitable than it does today. And, if you look at the average or the median super balances today, they're actually only 125,000 as a median, but that picks up the whole cross-section. But they're 20% lower for women versus men today. So in the report, it does show all of that improving over time, rising to almost quadrupling, 460,000 in today's dollars by 2060. But more importantly, it shows a more even distribution by gender. So yeah, the report does look at that, and fortunately, the outlook there does look far more equitable.
Very interesting concept, thinking about what's going to happen in 40 years' time, David.
Well, again, the assumptions are in there. They do their modelling, and that's the numbers the computer spits out. But look, part of it's attitudinal. And as you said, I think a lot of people today are thinking, well, no, I'm not going to rely on the age pension. It's not going to be enough. So therefore, what do I need to do to prepare for those years ahead.
Yep. David, thank you for talking to Fear and Greed.
Absolute pleasure. Cheers, Sean.
That was David Robertson, Head of Economic and Markets Research at Bendigo and Adelaide Bank. This is the Fear and Greed Daily Interview. Join me every morning for the full Fear and Greed podcast with all the business news you need to know. I'm Sean Aylmer. Enjoy your day.